Thanks everyone for joining me. This presentation's been rattling around my head for a while, and so I'm hoping I can put it all together in one place. I'm excited to try this out. So I've been talking about Alaska's energy future. I'll specifically be framing this around Homer Electric Association, our local power grid, the Kenai Peninsula, but it applies in a lot of ways to Alaska as a whole. And so I'll talk a bit about what an energy system is, what I mean by that, and why we need to change the way our energy system works right now. And then I'll get into the details. How do we generate electricity? How do we store electricity? And how do we use it? And how does that all fit together? I want to make this point that there is a possible future, and that's what this presentation is about. One possible future. It's not the only possible future for our energy systems, but I think it's one worth thinking about because it's, I think, one of the most accessible, easiest futures to get to that is also good. And that's what I'm going for. And so there are a lot of details in here, but that's kind of the big picture I want to get to. And I'm going to draw this funny diagram. I'm going to fill this out so those aren't like round heads with fuzzy hairdos. Those are blurred out things that will become clear as we go through the talk. To kind of paint one picture of how we could run an energy system. I think it's really easy to forget how central to our lives and energy systems are. You probably know that we all burn around 1,500, 2,000 calories a day by eating food, digesting it. That's how we walk, that's how we think, that's how we maintain our bodies. You can ask the same question about all the energy we consume outside our bodies, driving our cars, cooking dinner. You can convert all those things from whether kilowatt hours or whatever to calories. And it turns out that the number there is about 800,000 calories a day. So it's really a tiny, tiny percentage of the energy we consume is consumed within our bodies. Most of it is consumed from other energy systems other energy coming in. And it takes a really complicated system to bring all that to us so we have that energy when we need it. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of the big energy systems that surround us. And the first one's fossil fuels. This is the biggest one in the world today. It starts out with production, then we have to do things like refine oil, that sort of thing, move it around, and then eventually we consume that. It gets to the consumer. So there's this arc from production to consumption there. And we can draw a similar arc for electric energy systems. And so again, we have to produce it whether with fossil fuel power plants, renewables, nuclear power, that sort of thing. We do also have to mess with it after that. We have to get it places. We have to transform it into useful forms, and then we can consume it at the end. And so kind of the idea that I'm going to be exploring today is what if we took away that fossil fuel energy system entirely? And that means not only removing the biggest part of this complicated diagram, but also removing the part where it actually feeds into our electrical system. So it's a huge change to the way the system works right now. And it would be perfectly reasonable to ask how we can even survive without fossil fuels. So before I get to how, I want to talk a little bit about why. I'm just going to address this very briefly. But you probably are aware, fossil fuels, burning them leads to CO2 in the atmosphere. This is why our climate's currently in a state of crisis. We need to act quickly to reduce that while also adapting to the consequences of what we've already done. I'm not going to convince anyone of anything new here today, but I do want to note that when we talk about climate change and our fossil fuel dependence as one of the problems we face in the world today, it's what's sometimes called a wicked problem, which means that our human nature and our human systems are working against us at every turn. And one of the things that I think I'm hoping you get kind of a positive take out of this whole presentation, because I think actually energy system transformation is one of the least wicked parts of this very wicked problem. It's something we can actually do, and we can get it right. And I actually see that as kind of the carrot for us here on the Kenai Peninsula. If we do this right, then we are actually moving away from climate change and the catastrophe that is. There is a stick as well, and that's that most of our energy in Alaska comes from natural gas that comes out of Cook Inlet. And we've been getting natural gas out of Cook Inlet for a long time, and it's running out, which is not to say that literally there's just going to be none left someday, but it means that the economics is getting worse. It's getting more expensive, it's getting less predictable. So natural gas in Cook Inlet is running out. And when you get to that point, if you're heating your home or you're running your power plant on natural gas and the prices go up or you just can't get supply for a time, this is bad. So we don't want to be in that position. We want to get ahead of the game on this. And there's every reason to think that natural gas is not actually our best option. It's not our cheapest option anyway. If we look in the lower 48 where natural gas is actually much cheaper, renewable energy like solar and wind is getting so cheap that it's often outcompeting natural gas, even when you have to buy a new generation plant in order to get it. And if we look around Cook Inlet specifically, and the Kenai Peninsula specifically, the cheapest power we have right now doesn't come from natural gas. It comes from Bradley Hydroelectric Project. It's a big conventional hydro project. It's been around since 1991. And it provides the cheapest electricity we have. And we can actually look at the history of those prices. And what we see is that hydropower from Bradley has actually decreased in cost over time. Most of this is actually due to inflation. The costs have been fairly flat, but the dollar's worth less over time, so it's become cheaper. Natural gas, on the other hand, has increased at, a rate that would be fairly satisfying if it was an investment, over 5% per year increase over this long term here. And it's been a long time since gas was a cheaper way to generate electricity than hydropower. And so we would definitely like to see a future where hydropower would continue to be part of how we generate electricity. We can kind of think about how much electricity might we be generating that way. Right now we're somewhere around 15%. We actually don't know where we are exactly because we just expanded Bradley a bit. But with some reasonable kind of near-term changes, we could see that going up towards 25%, maybe even 30%. It's challenging to really imagine going a lot beyond that because hydropower is extremely site-specific. There aren't a million options to build hydropower. And part of that is the actual physical constraints that an engineer would be concerned about, and part of it is the environmental impacts. Many places where you put hydropower, you can actually have some pretty big negative effects. So I'm going to start filling out my diagram here. We'll get our first little bit here. We'll think in terms of something like 20% hydro. And I said 25 to 30%, but you'll see why I want to keep it a little low there as we go on here. Now we also have to talk about wind. This is a map of wind potential in our region here, the different colors. The darkest color there is not very good. You don't really want to put wind there. But that next color up is as good as where a lot of wind development is happening in the lower 48. And then the brightest colors are even better than that. So we have a lot of wind potential in this area. And if you're building infrastructure like wind generation, you kind of would rather put it near power lines, which is in orange, or roads, which are in black here. So you kind of want to be thinking about that and thinking about where you might want to put it. And also it's nice to shade out some of the protected land. Not that wind is always inconsistent with the protected status of different lands, but it's certainly easier to develop on unprotected lands. And so you can kind of just look at this map and see a few places that are potentially of interest. Looking just at the Caribou Hills and Bradley Lake near Homer here, that is enough wind generation potential to supply all of HEA's electricity, actually much of the rail belt. So there's a lot of wind power out there. Solar is sort of the grandmommy of renewables. Hydro and wind are just sort of side effects of solar. They're little leftovers, and so there's a tremendous amount of solar energy out there. It's a really attractive option because it's now become incredibly cheap to deploy solar energy, and also because it's relatively predictable. And that predictability actually makes it a really important part of a possible future grid. This is some solar production data from panels in my yard. Each dot represents 1 day of energy production. Didn't put a vertical axis on there. It doesn't matter for what I want to say. But right away you can see there's kind of a pattern here. There's a seasonal pattern where we get a lot more energy in the summer. We get next to nothing in the middle of winter. And you also see a lot of variability at any given time of year, presumably because the amount of clouds vary. There might be a few other factors in there as well. Now, looking at a plot like this, you can kind of get a sense of how much energy we might get from solar without doing anything really extraordinary within our existing grid. And the thought experiment to do is imagine that we built enough solar that, in this case, looked just like the panels in my yard, that we got all of our power for one day on the nicest day in summer from solar. Then how much of our power will we get total through the year? So what you're doing is you're comparing the average to that maximum. And so you could conceivably get something like 30%. Now, there's some big caveats there around storage, and we're going to get there in a minute. But this is probably order of magnitude the kind of energy you could provide using solar power. So if we go and continue filling out our diagram here, we'll be a little bit conservative again and say 20% solar, not 30%, and then fill in the rest with wind. We'll just say wind is abundant, so it's going to take up the slack here. Now, I've obviously alluded to storage already quite a bit. We definitely need to talk about storage, and I think when people think about storing electricity, the first thing they think of is lithium batteries. And actually, HEA has now a giant grid-tied lithium battery, which I don't know whether it's on today or it's going to be on next week or it turned on a week ago, but we're right around now is when they're turning this sucker on. And it's a big battery. It could power the entire HEA grid for an hour or two. Let's call it an hour and a half. Lithium batteries have become a really big part of the conversation about storage that's connected to electric grids. Throughout the United States, they're booming out there because they're a really good battery. They recharge really efficiently. They last a long time. There are some concerns about getting the lithium in order to make them, but they do a lot. And a lot of these lithium facilities, these lithium batteries, are especially appreciated for the fact that they clean up the electric supply. So when electricity is delivered to consumers, it needs to exactly match these very specific specifications of what the frequency and the amount of electricity going out there, and a battery can really help clean that up. Now, we can look back at this diagram and kind of imagine how we might use that storage. Now, I said each of these dots represents a whole day's generation. But if we were to look through a day, of course, it's nighttime. Sometimes we aren't generating anything from solar panels. Sometimes it's the middle of the day. So that generation pattern, the pattern through the day, is not exactly matched to when people want electricity. And so storage can help even that out. We can, when we have an excess in the middle of the day, we can store the energy, and then we can use it through the night when we need it there. And you could get a general sense we might need around half a day of storage in order to do the sort of smoothing that would apply to this solar panels. So if we're talking 12 hours, that's about 8 times what we have right now. So a lot more, but not an unimaginably large amount more. However, one of the challenges here is that wind is much more variable than solar, and so just 12 hours of storage is really probably not going to do it, and 12 hours is already quite a bit to get out of our batteries. So it would be nice if we had some trick where we could get some long-term storage in this system. I think it's worth thinking about how we store energy in the United States today. So this is a pie chart with nothing on it right now. I'll quiz you guys. I will hardly give you any time to answer, but how much of that pie do you think is lithium batteries that are deployed on the grid right now? How much of the U.S.'s energy storage is in lithium batteries today?
0.05%.
Very close. 0.07 is where we are. We've gone up a little bit from 0.05. Now, if we added all the other batteries, do you know that number?
1.3.
Less than that, about 0.6, 0.7%, something like that. So we add all the batteries together and we barely touched this pie. So we're clearly missing something, right? I mean, everyone thinks of batteries if they think of storing electricity, but that is apparently not the way we do it. And the way we actually do it in our grid is using something called pumped hydro, or pumped storage hydroelectricity. The way this technology works is you go and you find a mountain or a hill with a body of water next to it. And then you go and you put a reservoir up on top of that. You put a pipeline between, and you put a special turbine on that pipeline, and then connect it to the grid. So this turbine looks a lot like a normal hydro turbine, except it can be reversed. You can send electricity into it and use it as a pump and move water from the lower reservoir to the upper reservoir. So when you have an excess of electricity, you can pull the water up the hill, and then when you need it, you can allow it to flow back down. And the reason that when you talk about storage capacity, that this is the dominant technology, and it's not a new technology, so this has been around since 1907. It's also not obsolete. Like some of the major build out of pumped hydro was in 2014, 2015, looking at the total pumped hydro in the US. But the reason that this shows up so much is that while building something that looks just like the lithium battery that HEA has now would be fairly expensive, it might be competitive, it might not, depends on all the details. If you keep expanding the amount of storage, all you're doing is building that upper reservoir to be a little bit bigger. You find the right geometry, that might not be very expensive. And so you can actually get to a lot of storage. You can get to many hours, days, weeks, even months of storage in a pumped hydro facility. So this is something that can actually deal with that long-term storage issue. But now if we start to keep working on filling out our diagram here, I picked some numbers. I will confess this is not the sort of analysis you would want to see, which involves like second-by-second variations from all these generation and consumption sources. But I think that this gives us some sense of what we might want to have here. Something like 6 hours of battery storage, about 4 times what we have now. Something like 2 weeks of pumped storage hydro. Those might be, the sort of analysis that you'd want to do is one we absolutely should do. HEA should be doing this today, I think, to get those numbers much more refined than what I have here. Now we've gotten to 100% renewable grid, and so it might be attractive to just go home now. This is great. We were 100%, sounds really good. But the problem is that actually most of the fossil fuels we consume, we don't consume in order to generate electricity. A lot of our energy goes to heating homes and to transportation. Some other things too, but those are the 2 really big ones. So we have to address those as well. And I'll start out with heating. So there's good news and bad news here. So the good news is heat is really easy to make. You can actually just light some sticks you find on the ground on fire. If I took an axe and went into the wall of this building and found a couple of wires and just joined them together, maybe I'd have to shove a penny into the breaker box first, I would generate heat at 100% efficiency. It would be a really good way to generate heat. It would be in all the wires in the house and would catch on fire. It wouldn't be good in that way, but I could put a wire in there instead that has a specific resistance, and then I can control where and how much heat is produced. So generating heat with electricity is super easy. The problem is that heat, it takes a lot of energy to produce enough heat to make a building comfortable. It takes about 5 times as much energy as all of our electricity consumption in order to heat all the buildings. And so this presents a real challenge. That's a tremendous amount of energy to be getting out of electricity. And it would be nice if there was a trick. And it turns out there is a trick. And that's that we not only can we create heat from whole cloth by consuming electricity, we can also pump it around. We can find heat in places and move it where we want it. And this sounds a little bit crazy, but it's exactly what we do with air conditioners and freezers. And I think it's worth just pausing for a moment and picturing what happens when you take a cold, like take it out of your ice box, out of a cooler. You have a fillet of salmon, you put it in your freezer and it freezes. What happens there? So that freezer is this appliance that's going to remove the heat that was in that cold slab of salmon, and it has to put it somewhere. You can't just destroy energy. The closest thing you do to destroying energy just makes it into heat. Well, it has to move that heat somewhere else. It moves it into your house. So you're actually warming your house up by cooling a cold piece of salmon. And so this is heat pumps, and heat pumps have gotten very efficient in recent years, and they actually are now a completely practical way to heat your home. You can actually pull heat from the cold air outside, bring it inside your house, and warm the house up. This is standard technology in some places, in Scandinavia, even in areas of Alaska. Here on the Kenai Peninsula, it's actually quite prevalent in Seward at this point. They're starting to really develop it there. So this provides a really attractive solution. And then instead of 5 times as much we're only going to need to double our electricity supply. Still a big step, but it's much more doable. Now at this point, transportation may sound like the easiest problem I have to talk about all day. We know that electric cars are super popular. It's not a huge leap of imagination that we put this very similar technology into small boats, into air taxis, this sort of thing. And I do think we're headed in that direction. We should move that direction as quickly as we can. But there is a caveat, and that's that long-haul transportation is really difficult. And that's the only thing that I'm going to bring up in the whole arc of this presentation that is more in the realm of experimental technologies rather than something that is established and widely deployed in the economy and the energy systems today. We do have ideas of how to do that, even how to get, say, fuel for long-haul transportation from electricity, but none of these are standard technology yet. But if we did get our energy for transportation from the electric grid, that's going to tack on a bit more. It's not as much as heat. We've gone through and put together this picture of what our energy system might look like if we got all together on this. And it's been kind of complicated and messy in some ways. I can imagine that there's many things you might be thinking of that are left out. I do want to hit one thing that's kind of glossed over in this, and that's that I explained a electric grid based on our current demand, and I came up with the stuff on the left. And then I went and more than doubled the demand at the end. And so we do have to deal with that little problem. Hydro is probably the hardest piece of that because, as I mentioned, we can't necessarily site hydro wherever we want, so the amount of hydropower is limited. I said maybe we can get to 30% on our current grid, so maybe it's going to end up being like 15 after we increase our demand, or maybe we find a bit more and we get to 20. Solar we can scale mostly with increased demand, and wind we can do that as well, as long as our storage is also planned out from the start to be for a system that is going to have all of this additional demand. So that's a key point. We don't want to be so focused on our 100% renewable grid that we forget that grid is going to ultimately have to be a lot bigger. And I think it's worth just shoving things over a little bit and making just a bit more room for the smart grid on here. Because especially as we see heating and transportation become big demands on our electric grid, having different smart grid technologies, including technologies that are actually being widely experimented with in Alaska, especially on our microgrids that are out in remote Alaska, where the cost of energy is so high that they're super motivated to try all these experimental things. Smart grids are an established technology at that level. Some things have never been tried, but there are a lot of things that have, and they could really help kind of resolve any rickety parts in this whole picture. All right, so I will leave it there with Einstein and his lightning bolt tattoo, and I would be really happy to take any questions you have.